Hi everyone, this is Dan Clanton, and this is our mini lecture over Genesis chapters 12 through 25. Let's start out in chapter 12 looking at two central components. First, there's an initial vague promise of God to Abram in chapter 12 verses 2 to 3 and verse 7. Once Abram arrives in Canaan, he builds an altar and invokes the name of the Lord in chapter 12 verse 8, which is odd because the divine name isn't going to be revealed until the third chapter of Exodus. Secondly, in chapter 12 verse 10 through chapter 13 verse 1, we have the first of three instances in Genesis in which a Hebrew tells a foreign king that his wife is his sister in order to protect himself from harm. We'll see this also in chapter 20 and in chapter 26. Next, in chapter 15, we have the first full statement of the covenant between God and Abram, along with a subsequent ceremony to solidify the arrangement. Note especially the two-part promise that we find in chapter 15:5 and 18. That is, offspring and land. The theme of offspring is going to be a dominant theme for the remainder of the Pentateuch, that is, the first 5 books of the Bible. We won't hear much about land until we get to the book of Joshua. In chapter 16, we find a continuation of that theme of progeny or offspring. We already knew from chapter 11, verse 30, that Sarai was barren, but now that barrenness leads her to offer her maid Hagar to Abram so that his line would be continued. And I want to make 6 points about this. First, in chapter 16, Hagar is not a slave. The Hebrew word used to describe her is shifcha, which means something like a maid, and besides that, no wandering farmer like Abram would have had an Egyptian slave at this point in ancient Near Eastern history. Egypt at this point was the most powerful force on the planet. Second, substitute wives were used commonly to ensure the patrimony in the ancient Near East. Here's what I mean by that. It was a very common marital arrangement for people to be engaged in what we would call polygynous relationships. So we're not talking about polygamy here, which is where both partners have multiple spouses. Here we're talking about polygyny, where the husband would have several wives. If one wife was not able to have children, then a second wife would be moved up in the line of succession, as it were, so that they could have children, hopefully male children, so that the inheritance that had been gathered by the father could be passed securely to a male heir. If there was no male heir, then the question of inheritance would be thrown up in the air, and it would be much more plausible that that clan would be dissolved. Third, note the marginal status of Hagar here. She's a foreigner, she's a servant, she's a woman, she's childless. She's virtually on the bottom of the barrel. Fourth, Hagar goes beyond her familial role as the number 2 wife in chapter 16, verse 4, when she looks down on Sarah. And that leads to some harsh consequences, and that's my 5th point. In chapter 16, verse 6, the verb that's used, that's translated in English as dealt harshly, is the same verb used in the angel's command to Hagar in chapter 16, verse 9. Both of them carry the connotation of tormenting or humiliation. In fact, the same verb is used in Genesis 34:2 to describe the rape of Dinah, and in the first chapter of Exodus to describe the treatment of the Israelites in Egypt. So not only is Sarah pretty violently abusing Hagar, but in chapter 16, verse 9, when Hagar encounters this angel, the angel tells Hagar to return to Sarah and let her continue to abuse her. Sixth and finally, With the arrival of that angel in chapter 16, verse 7, not only do we see the very first angel in biblical literature, but also notice that Hagar is the first woman to have what we call a theophanic experience. A theophany is when one experiences God in the human realm or has an encounter with the divine. So Hagar becomes the first woman to have a theophany in the Hebrew Bible. She's also the first woman to receive a promise of offspring, just like Abram did in his covenant with God in chapters 12 and 15. Finally, Hagar becomes the only and first character in the Bible to name God in chapter 16, verse 13. So when we're looking at chapter 16 and the portrayal of Hagar therein, it's a fascinating tapestry of firsts and marginality. It makes you wonder, why did God pick someone like Hagar to make that kind of promise to? When we look at chapters 17 to 18, we need to note, first of all, that here we have a priestly version. Remember our documentary hypothesis information? A priestly version of the covenant with Abram. This is the third and final covenant that we hear about between God and Abram. And here again, we have the dual promise of descendants or offspring and land. Note, though, there's a special condition in this telling of the covenant relationship. In this telling, Abraham must circumcise all the males in his kin group for his part of the covenant. So traditionally, covenants are reciprocal agreements. Party A does X for party B, and party B does Y for party A. We haven't seen that so much in chapters 12 or 15, but here in chapter 17, it becomes explicit what Abraham has to do for his part in the covenant, and that is to circumcise all the males in his kin group. Moving on in the latter part of chapter 17, in 17 verses 17 to 21, we have the prediction of the birth of Isaac, and this prediction is enacted in chapter 18, verses 1 through 15, when three divine messengers visit Sarah and Abraham. They announce Sarah's impending pregnancy, and she laughs to herself in 18:12. The angels get upset, even though Abraham not only laughed, but he fell on his face and laughed in chapter 17, verse 17. Sarah was off on stage left, laughing solely to herself, but Abraham falls on his face. It's also interesting to note that we have different versions of this story. We have a Greek version in what we call the Septuagint translation, and we have a Hebrew version in what we call the Masoretic text. In that Masoretic text, in the Hebrew text, Sarah's question to herself in chapter 18, verse 12 reads, "Now that I am withered, am I to have enjoyment with my husband so old?" The word translated in English as enjoyment, or edna, literally means something like abundant moisture and represents the antithesis of the word translated as withered. So you see what Sarah's talking about here. This really is TMI, Sarah. We don't want to hear about your abundant moisture as you're having enjoyment with your husband. The Greek translators of the Septuagint, though, found this talk unbecoming of Sarah, whom they imagined as a proper Greek matriarch. So they altered her speech to have Sarah say, quote, "It hasn't happened to me yet, and now my husband is old." So while this might redeem Sarah's character from any kind of sexual innuendo, what the Hebrew text does is to continue the practice in Genesis of presenting these characters as fully human figures, with all their foibles and faults on public display. Moving on to chapters 18 to 20, we start out with the story of Sodom and Gomorrah in chapter 18, verse 16 through chapter 19, verse 38. Note here that Abraham is not only the first human to enter into counsel with God, he's also the first human to dispute with God in chapter 18, verses 23 to 33. This is a remarkable passage where Abraham takes it upon himself to push God on the limits of divine justice. So God announces that the city is going to be destroyed, but Abraham pushes back and asks, what if there are righteous people in the city? And how many righteous people do there have to be before you're willing to call off the destruction? Again, this is a remarkable chapter, and it's paradigmatic in the Jewish tradition of how Jews understand their relationship with God. In the end, Abraham's efforts are mostly wasted. He gets God to agree that if there are only 10 righteous people in the cities, then they won't be destroyed. But as you know, the cities are destroyed. So unfortunately, there weren't even 10 righteous folks in there, the biblical text tells us. Now, the story of the two angels' visit to Sodom is found in chapter 19, verses 1 to 12, which, as we'll see later in the course, has a fairly obvious parallel in Judges 19, verses 22 to 30. There are four main questions we want to ask of the text here. First of all, what did the Sodomites want to do? Is this an instance of homosexual intercourse, or is this rape? If this is rape, then the sex act has very little to do with sexual desire and much more to do with power and dominance. And the question then becomes, if this is a story about rape and not about same-sex relationships, can we then take this story as an indicator of the Bible's stance on same-sex relations? I don't think we can, because I don't think this story is concerned with what today we might call same-sex relations. I think this story is about rape. Second, how are we to evaluate Lot's response? Feminist scholars have shown that Lot can be read as kind of a dim, callous character. He's not the smartest bulb in the bunch. The angels basically have to shove him out of the town after warning him several times to get himself and his family out of there. As such, his lack of concern for his daughters becomes part of a larger character trait, not an isolated incident. Interpreters that invoke the theme of hospitality to explain Lot's actions ignore the fact that, quote, there are no indications from the Hebrew Scriptures that sexual abuse or other violence is condoned if done in the service of hospitality, end quote. So when Lot offers his daughters to the town people, this cannot be explained away as an example of ancient Near Eastern hospitality. So we have to figure out another way to explain it. Third, what's going on with Lot's wife? This is a difficult question because this seems to be more of what we would call an explanatory or an etiological tale. That is, most commentators think that this story serves to explain the presence of unusual salt formations in the area traditionally understood to be the area in which the story takes place. We're unsure if that's the correct answer or not. So with question 3, we sort of have to just shake our heads. Finally, question 4, what happened with Lot's daughters? Is this again an explanatory story? Is this payback for Lot's earlier option? Note the irony of Lot being the subject of sexual exploitation when he was willing to allow his daughters to be sexually abused. If we read the story that way, the daughters emerge as active shapers of their own destiny, even going so far as to naming the children themselves. And it's those children's names that push us toward the understanding of this story as an etiological or explanatory story. After all, the people who issue from those children become some of the most tenacious enemies of Israel in later history. So what better way for Israelite writers to denigrate or insult their enemies than by saying, well, you had your origin in a drunken incestuous union. Take that. Finally, in chapter 20, we have another "she is my sister" story. This is an awkward story to say the least. As Catherine Darr notes, there's a strange chronological discrepancy here in that it becomes very difficult to explain why Sarah, who's now almost 90 years old, would be so attractive to Abimelech. In chapter 21, we have two important events. First, Isaac is born in chapter 21, verse 2. And then in 21, 8 to 21, we have a doublet, or a seeming repetition, of the story of Hagar that we saw in chapter 16. There are several differences between this version and the version in chapter 16, though. First of all, here Hagar is specifically referred to as a female slave who, unlike when she ran away in chapter 16, is driven out in this chapter. The reason here, though, is ambiguous. If we look in chapter 21, verse 10, the issue seems to be inheritance. That is, Sarah doesn't want Hagar's son, Ishmael, to share the patrilineal inheritance that her son, Isaac, would be entitled to. But since the relative positions of the sons are convoluted by the promise of God, some interpreters have looked for a more sinister motive. Put differently, Ishmael is the firstborn son, and as such should receive the inheritance. However, God has promised to Sarah that Isaac will be the son of the covenant. So because there seems to be some ambiguity here, some scholars and some interpreters have asked, is there a more sinister motive? Is there a wicked motive here? In a collection of Jewish rabbinic commentary on Genesis called Genesis Rabbah, the term playing in chapter 21, verse 9, is read as an expression of lewdness, perhaps even sexual abuse. Robert Alter, in his translation of Genesis, sees the term laughing as a possible pun on the name of Isaac. Remember that Isaac's name, Yitzhak, means the one who laughs. Alter thinks that here Ishmael could be, quote-unquote, Isaac-ing. That is, quote, Sarah sees Ishmael presuming to play the role of Isaac, child of laughter, presuming to be the legitimate heir. So, is Hagar driven out because of the issue of inheritance? Is she driven out because her son Ishmael committed some sort of offense against Isaac? We're unsure. Second, note also that unlike chapter 16, there's no well in chapter 21. Instead, there's a vast wilderness that emphasizes the danger posed to Ishmael and Hagar. And finally, there's a difference in theophanies. As we saw in chapter 16, Hagar is told to return and to submit to more torment and humiliation from Sarah. Here, though, she's told not to return and is instead given a promise regarding the positive future of Ishmael, unlike the ambiguous prediction that we saw in chapter 16, verses 11 to 12. Moving on to chapter 22, this chapter in Jewish tradition is called the Akedah, that is, the binding of Isaac. And this story represents the climax of Abraham's story. We as readers are told that it's a test of Abraham by God. The chapter is generally recognized as one of the masterpieces of the Pentateuch, and the language is sparse and rugged. Abraham's asked to sacrifice his beloved son Isaac in seeming contradiction to the central emphasis on offspring that we've seen in the story up until this point. One can only speculate as to the feelings of both Abraham and Isaac, as well as Sarah, who's oddly absent from the entire episode. The Hebrew's clear here. This is going to be an offering, a slaughter, or, as the Hebrew puts it, an olah, that is, where we get our word holocaust, of Isaac. Abraham binds Isaac to the wood, raises the cleaver, not a knife, but a meat cleaver, to slaughter him when an angel appears to tell him that he needn't do so. He has passed the test of faith, and Isaac is allowed to live. Obviously, in a narrative of such sparseness and importance, there are many questions that we need to ask. First, why is Abraham tested? There doesn't seem to be an obvious reason given in the biblical text. In his writings, the Jewish author and scholar Elie Wiesel quotes a Jewish interpretation that claims Abraham was tested because he unjustly favored Isaac over his other son Ishmael, thus introducing into the story the possibility that Abraham felt guilty over his treatment of Ishmael and his mother. Perhaps this explains why Abraham, the only human thus far who's argued with God, doesn't argue with God in this chapter when God tells him to kill his own son. Second, how old is Isaac in this episode? Is he old enough to understand what's going on? Is he old enough to resist? In his work, John Levinson notes, quote, "Our ignorance of Isaac's age makes it difficult to interpret his poignant question in chapter 22, verse 7. This is where Isaac asks Abraham, 'Where is the lamb for a burnt offering?' Levinson continues, 'Most Jewish commentators see him as an adult and thus a willing participant in his own sacrifice, the prototype, that is, of a Jewish martyr. But what if Isaac is not old enough to participate in his own sacrifice? What if he's a young boy? What happens to our understanding of the story at that point? Third, as I mentioned a minute ago, where's Sarah? What effect does this story have on Sarah, given that she dies immediately following it in chapter 23, verse 2? Again, Elie Wiesel, in his work, notes that some interpreters believe that Satan, angry that Isaac had not been sacrificed, appeared to Sarah disguised as Isaac and told her what had happened on the mountain, after which she dies. Now, it's okay if you heard that and thought, wait, what? That's a fanciful interpretation to try and explain why Sarah dies immediately after this story when she's not a character in it. Fourth and finally, in chapter 22, verse 19, we're told that, quote, Abraham returned to his young men, but we're not told where Isaac is. So where's Isaac? Some Jewish interpreters hold that Isaac left the mountain to go off on a journey of self-discovery and study. Isaac does resurface, though, as we know, because, as we'll see in our next section, Abraham dies in chapter 25, verse 8, only after securing a wife for his beloved son Isaac. So, what conclusions can we draw from the story of Abraham, of Sarah, of Hagar, of Ishmael, of Isaac? In these chapters, we see Abraham cutting a covenant with God, arguing with God, and obeying God. Abraham, Isaac, and Hagar in particular become models, paradigms of human-divine relationships at the same time their own troubles are exposed.